Is it responsible to believe in a God that the pre-scientific, often superstitious Jews believed in, which was over 4,000 years ago? And is it safe to devote your whole life in obeying Jesus and his teaching, who lived 2 millenniums back?
Okay, so the question seems to have to do with the antiquity of the records. Is it safe to believe in a God that the Jews believed in 4,000 years and more ago? Especially with some of the features of the stories about God, which sound to our modern ears fantastic, maybe even mythological. Or to believe in Jesus, who lived 2,000 years ago, and for whom we have records that are about that old only. Is that reasonable? I think it's reasonable. I think human beings all believe in some things that are that old. Most people believe in, ancient Greece. It was more than 2,000 years ago. Most people believe in ancient Egyptian culture. That was that old too. To believe that those things happened, the passing of time doesn't really make them less credible. That Jesus lived on the earth 2,000 years ago doesn't make it any less important than if he'd lived 2 years ago or 2 million years ago. The fact is, the significance of his life is pretty much unchanging, at least if he is who he claimed to be. If the stories are true, that is the more important question than how old they are, because lots of true stories are quite old. And so the question then is it rational to believe in such a God and in such a Jesus as we read about in these old records? And the question of reasonable, obviously, is something that not all people interpret the same way. Some people find certain things reasonable that others will find difficult to find reasonable. To my mind, if reasonable means something consistent with rationality and logic, I certainly don't see any problem with these things. In fact, my own faith is based on the way I assess logically evidence. Some people have maybe a little more mysterious way of reaching faith than that. I'm pretty much a stickler for being able to follow the evidence. I actually believe the truth always has the best evidence. The truth always has the best arguments. And therefore, I always want to hear all the arguments for and against anything, and see whatever evidence there is for and against anything, and then decide on the basis of where the strongest evidence is what's true. Now, as far as I can tell, the evidence that the Bible is true is fairly strong, and therefore I take the stories in the Bible to be true. Now, the only reason I would ever have any trouble doing so, perhaps, is if I didn't believe there's a God. Okay? If we believe there's no God, then of course the stories are ridiculous. You can't have the creation story and the flood story and the Sodom and Gomorrah story and the dividing of the Red Sea story and the story of Jesus walking on water and healing the sick and raising the dead and rising himself from the dead. You can't have those stories credible if there's no God. On the other hand, if there is a God, then all bets are off. You never know what he might do. If there is a God who can do supernatural things, who's to say what he did and did not do? The way we would actually know is if someone was there to witness it. We can't really just sit here philosophically and say, well, I believe there's a God, but he can't do this or he can't do that. If there is a God, he certainly is living in a realm beyond our own and is beyond our capability to fully analyze. So the best way we would know whether it's reasonable to believe in such a God is if there were credible witnesses who testify to what he did. If, for example, there are witnesses to the resurrection of Christ, which there were many, and some of them left written records of it. Or if there were witnesses to the Exodus, or any of these things. If the witnesses are reliable, there's nothing about the stories that are intrinsically incredible, except to the person who's already decided that there's no God. A person who's made that decision hasn't done so on any basis except prejudice. So one of the least reasonable things is prejudice. I think, therefore, that if we can disabuse ourselves of our prejudices and be open to all possibilities that the evidence may support, I think that the evidence is very good in favor of the stories of the Bible and therefore of the God and his intervention in the Bible. If people wish not to believe in God, then they will, of course, find the stories ridiculous to believe, but they have to ask themselves, why am I choosing not to believe in God? Do I have proof there's no God? No. Do the majority of intelligent people think there's no God? No. Well, then why would I not believe in God? Well, the answer usually is something like, because I don't like people who believe in God. I don't like Christians. I don't like having the idea of a father figure looking over my shoulder all the time. That's what Christopher Hitchens said. You know, how horrible that would be to have a God watching us all the time. Well, if people don't want there to be a God watching, they can tell themselves there isn't one. That doesn't make it so. The real question is, does anyone have a real good reason not to believe in God? In my opinion, I don't think so. And so I think believing in that God and that Jesus in the Bible are very reasonable options.